people out there on planet Earth. Hello, everybody. Hope you're enjoying your Sunday evening or your Monday morning. Konnichiwa.
Yeah. Well, Gavin's in Australia too, so
Yes. I like you've got the attire for today. Ian, there's the nice shirt.
yeah. Oh, I've got a whole bunch.
Jay's got his Browns. I got the Bills right here. Everybody's representing
Yeah.
Their region. Everybody's representing their region.
their region.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Canada doesn't have an NFL team, so
You
Me,
almost
Batman
did.
Rush.
We almost gave you our team in the early 2000s with that debacle of sharing a stadium for how many years that was.
Oh, that's right. They did do that.
yeah, that
forgot
was
about
like that was like the late noughts.
Yeah. Yeah, that's when Ralph Wilson was running on gas or fumes at the end of his ownership period before the Pergulas took over. Let's see. I think we're ready to roll here. I'm gonna hit record, and I'm gonna count us in 1 second. There we go. And 3, 2, 1. Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. It's like a
I don't think that's going to catch on.
It's a new kind of gum. By Dior.
D hyphen.
It would actually be a comma, or no, it would be a tilde.
Yeah.
Or an asterisk. Remember that upside down pointy thing? Was that an arrow?
Yeah, what the hell is that thing?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Up arrow. Hey, this is an 80s episode. And for the first time, we have a guest joining us for this episode because we're talking about a band from the Great White North. So, of course, we have to bring on someone with experience. And that person is Ian McIver. He's been here before. This is his first, I guess you'd say, rock performance or rock band that he's come to chat about. How you doing, Ian?
Groovy. Yeah, no, this is a very personal band for me. So I'll let you introduce, and then I can go into my history and connection with the band.
Sure. So we had an 80s poll. It was 4 bands from 1989. And I chose that because somebody had suggested Rush. And I was like, well, this album came out in 89. I was like, I like that weird period where like alternative is happening, but you still have like mainstream releases. Sort of, this is when Jane's Addiction is putting out a record. This is when, Faith No More is getting on MTV, REM, that kind of stuff. And it's sort of clashing with sort of more established artists. So I put up in the poll Rush, Presto, the Sugar Cubes here today, tomorrow, next week. Of course, Sugar Cubes was fronted by Bjork. 10,000 Maniacs, Blind Man Zoo, and White Zombies Make Them Die Slowly, which is the album that they released prior to their breakthrough record with Thunder Kiss 65 on it. So the winner ended up being Rush, Presto, with 43% of the vote, 21% Sugar Cubes and 10,000 Maniacs, and White Zombie was last place with 14%. We're all familiar with Rush. This is not a band. This is like when we did AC/DC or Neil Young, and we're looking at oddball albums from the 80s, even though they're well-known artists. So let me ask you specifically, did you get this album when it came out, Ian, or was this something you came to later?
No, so I came into this shortly after. So I did bring a prop in, which is my connection. So unfortunately, I've got my Godin. Zeta's had one bass here. and that. So in 89, 90 in school, I started to play bass. I played guitar previously, and that through my parents doing the traditional lessons, and then I transitioned in 1990, 89, 90. So when I started high school in 91, this is when I got my bass here. And with it, the store owner gave me a copy of Bass Player magazine. And with it, it was going through top 5 bassists, and Geddy Lee was number 1. And so this was around the time just a month prior to Roll the Bones, the follow-up album to this being released. So I was playing in the school bands, and my friends in the band nicknamed me Geddy throughout high school. And it stayed with high school. I mean, I still have ran into some people since, more so in university, who would call me that. The couple of the music teachers called me that as well. So I mean, it definitely stuck with me. But because of that magazine, and also the nickname, everything kind of happened all at the same time. I started getting into the band. So Roll the Bones came out, but then I started looking way back. And so Presto was one of the early albums that I got as well. So, and then I started to work my way through the discography and that. So, no, I mean, this is, I would say, arguably my second favorite band. I mean, Depeche Mode is cut and dry, clear winner, and I could make a case for one or two other bands for the second place, but it's like the joke in Futurama where we got the racetracks, and it's like, it's a quantum finish, and it's like, you change the results by measuring it. So, no, I mean, Rush, I've seen 8 times. They're the second most band I've seen behind 9 Inch Nails at 9, although I could give partial credit for the How to Destroy Angels project in 2013 that Trent Reznor did with his wife. So, like I said, I mean, even with my collection behind here, I mean, I don't have too much for vinyl, but down below where I have all my tour books and that, I mean, it's Depeche Mode and Rush, probably because the band's big enough to have it. So they, like I said, they stuck through, and I mean, you are right. They are one of the rare rock bands that obviously are very much up there. I mean, there are a couple others that I enjoy. I mean, I enjoy like Pink Floyd. I mean, through my father, obviously the Beatles. I mean, you can see the box sets behind it there again through my parents. So I mean, I'm not just completely stuck in the Gothic underground, so to speak. and that, but yeah, so
of course,
and, yeah, but no, and this album, I mean, I remember when I joined the union year and a half ago. I mean, I was going through all the previous Patreon posts. I don't know how many other people do that, but I definitely did, and saw your list of albums. I saw this one, and for the band itself, I mean, I wouldn't say this is so much an oddball album, and we can discuss that as we go through, but it definitely is an underappreciated album from the band.
For sure.
Jay, I don't know about you, but like, I feel like I was listening to Rush before I knew that it was Rush. Like, it was just always on the radio, like on classic, even it wasn't really classic rock radio. It was just like whatever the rock stations were playing at the time. Like, you always heard Working Man. That was like always on your FM rock station. Fly By Night, you know.
Cleveland radio played a big part in breaking Rush in the US. By playing Working Man and everything after that. So I know you lived in Cleveland for a while. I lived there my whole life. So to me, yes, I'm with you. Like, it was very normal to hear every album Rush would put out, the singles would get played on the radio, period. There was no like, well, it's not, maybe this album's not right. Cleveland radio, both the modern rock radio station, WMMS, and the classic rock radio station, both played Rush every time they released anything. So like it's very ingrained in if you grew up in Cleveland in the 70s and 80s and even 90s, very ingrained in your what you think of as classic rock. And
Yep.
yeah, you know all the songs.
So do you remember when you actually picked up a record from them and went, I'm going to buy this?
It
Or
was
was gifted it?
probably, yeah, I remember when this came out, and I remember when Roll the Bones came out. Those were the first two that I remember like the releases of. Prior to that, it was always like more of a like, oh, this is old music that came out before. These were the first two that like I was aware of music and into music, and I remember when the albums were released and when they were doing the tours. I think Counterparts was the first album I bought. So up until that point, it was sort of like a band I heard on the radio, and some of the stuff I liked and some of it I didn't, and it was just there. It really wasn't until Counterparts where that was also kind of marketed as like, oh, this is their return. They've gotten rid of the synthesizers and like they're a rock band again.
They said the same thing about this album too for Presto.
Right.
So.
I have a feeling they probably said that for this and Roll the Bones and Counterparts. But yeah, Counterparts was the first record I actually bought.
Okay. I'm like you. Counterparts was probably, and I got it through maybe BMG or something like that, or Columbia House, like early on, like when people were signing up for that, like in high school and college. But I remember seeing a video for Subdivisions because it took place like in a school. I remember seeing that a lot on MTV, and it was I think it was on VH1 too, because for some reason they were a band that got like played on both. They were like a weird band because they were a hard rock band, but they also appealed to like really nerdy people like myself. Not dudes who were like metal with like jean jackets and leather and patches and, you know, drove in the 80s, drove a
they could
very
cross
loud
that
car.
line though. Like
that's the thing. Rush was all over the place.
They would cross a lot of lines other bands couldn't.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that video because I mean, I always, whenever I see that, I mean, I look back because I mean, yeah, there's the school parts, but then when they're driving downtown, I mean, that's downtown Toronto. You see, and though the building's not there, the old Neon Records for Sam the Record Man, which was a major Canadian record chain. I mean, I bought a lot of music there. And same way, even when I went down to Toronto to visit family, my father and myself would go there. Same way when I was at university, taking the bus home from university, I'd have to stop through Toronto again, stopping there. And the downtown's been, I wouldn't say gentrified, but it's the level below. It's that close. And you just see that. It's like, that's how it used to be. And especially when we look at it's not just with Rush, but other bands filming around Toronto in the 80s. So it's like, yeah, it definitely digs up a lot of memories just from how things were in the city.
Interesting. I do want to mention just some facts about this record. So this is the 13th album by Rush. It was released November of 1989. It actually is the start of them on being on Atlantic Records. They had previously been on Mercury, and they I guess they referred to it as the relationship had gone stale with them and Mercury, and so their deal was up and they were free agents. So they went home and took some time off, and then the guy who had produced their previous couple of records was not available because he had moved on to some other. So they went with a different guy for this record, and sort of we're like, we did 4 albums worth of synthesizers. Why don't we bring the guitars back a little bit let's bring it back around to where we were. So that was like a conscious decision on this record to tone down the keyboards. And also I think I read that Alex Lifeson, the guitar player, was like just kind of over, like he couldn't figure out what to do with his guitar stuff, trying to fit it into the synthesizer sound, and he was getting frustrated.
But I mean, you look at other rock bands throughout the 80s. I mean, the guitar parts definitely minimized throughout the 80s. I mean, hair metal aside, and all those power ballads. But I mean, it wasn't just them that this was the only problem with. I mean, it definitely was a symptom, but wasn't the overall problem with music in '89.
Well, we got some comments on the poll that I want to share. Jeremy Amen said the only album I actually care about here is Presto. However, while it might be a little controversial or maybe underappreciated, I don't see it needing to be dug out. I'm going to vote for White Zombie, as I think it will enjoy hearing the boys attack the mediocrity of it.
Wow.
David Gorgo said none of the above. This is the shittiest the 90s. This is the shit the 90s were created to destroy. I don't like you talking about Natalie Merchant that way. She's a fine lady. She's a teacher now. She's educating the youth. Gavin said an easy one. 80s White Zombie is fantastic. Oh, there would have been some words between Jeremy and Gavin if White Zombie had won. Whitney Bueller said, I voted for Presto because I want to hear Tim and Jay tackle a Rush album. I don't think I've ever listened to it, though. It looks to be the lowest rated Rush studio album on AllMusic and next to last on Rate Your Music. Ought to be an interesting review if it wins, which it did. Darren Leach said, Bjork is overrated. So a big no to the Sigur Cubes. Wow.
Wow.
That is some heat. That is a hot take right there.
I will say the stuff Bjork did with Mark Bell, rest in peace. I mean, in the '90s, I mean, that was some very fine electronic music.
Oh yeah, Debut is, I mean, incredible. I don't understand what she's doing a lot of times. I saw that new single and the video, which basically uses, I think it's like 6 bass clarinets, and then there's like, you know, a guy playing like a digital drum kit, and then she's singing, quote unquote, and I don't know what's going on exactly, but it's very interesting. It is the most alien I've ever heard a human being sound. Like if you had told me we've gotten a communication from another planet and this is what it sounds like,
oh boy,
like, yeah, weird. It sounds a little bit like Bjork, but it's definitely alien.
She looks the part.
Well, yeah, she does. Jeremy Mann said, this album and Joe Satriani's Flying in a Blue Dream are two of the most 1989 sounding albums I've ever heard. Like, I go back and listen to them frequently. They sound exactly like 1989. It's not just that they know it, that I know it came out in 89. They still sound like that last gasp of 80s production. And I still love them. That's interesting. And then you had some comments that he responded to. I'll let you address your comments, but he said I would argue that a lyrical theme was present. A lot of it was about magic and illusion, just not magic. That this album is not a concept album, according to Neil Peart. This is just a collection of lyrics, according to what he said in the Wikipedia page, and also that one of the songs is just built around anagrams.
Yeah. So just, that's true. But this album, he didn't approach any themes. I mean, even if you look at his lyrics throughout the '80s, I mean, it definitely went from the literary to far more observational humanitarianism, I'd say. So, and it's not just this album, but like you look at the previous albums, I mean, Hold Your Fire was based around time, Power Windows with Power, and even the follow-up with Roll the Bones with Chance. So, I mean, but this was one where, like, as you said, they were going back to basics, and that with just the guitar, bass, and drums, and all the other stuff in between.
Well, let's get into this. We've talked about it enough. Let's actually talk about it. Jay, tell me one thing you liked about Presto by Rush.
This album just made me feel really good. I don't know. It just, it hit all the right nostalgia notes for me with this band. I found it very, even though there's some darker subjects on this record for Rush, Scars, for example, and Red Tide are pretty ominous. They still like have these choruses that are just very optimistic and uplifting. I also really like the songwriting here. This feels like, them at probably their most pop songwriting format. There's not a lot of like really indulgent instrumental tracks on here. The running times, tend to be in the 4 to 5 minute range. For Rush, that's pretty short. So they're not indulging in long prog jams here, but the songs still have really, I think, sophisticated builds, dynamics. I think Available Light is a great example of this song that kind of starts off as a piano song and it kind of slowly builds, and you get to this chorus that's just triumphant sounding. It's just huge, this big burst out of nowhere, and it's not following the typical kind of piano ballad, power ballad format. It's way more sophisticated than that, than like how they go from this sparse, slow piano song into pretty rapidly building to this big triumphant sounding chorus. It has some, I think, great vocals on it as well. That's another song example. Available as another example where there's this cool like layered falsetto at the end of the choruses. I think Geddy in general just sounds great in this record. He's doing a lot of overdubs, which is fine, but I think vocally he's just sounding like confident and as good as he does on anything. And it's just great to hear these guys play. I mean, I don't know. This is a record that I was familiar with. Show Don't Tell, that got played quite a bit on the radio, and I think I'd heard it on like Greatest Hits, but I hadn't really spent much time with this record. So to me, it was almost like Rush had just released a new record that I hadn't heard before, and it just kind of took me back through just how magical they are in terms of the way they play together. I think the interplay here between the guitar, bass, and keyboards is probably the most successful of any of the records where they bring keys in. Now, that's not to say I don't like some of the earlier stuff that's the keyboard heavy. I think some of that stuff is actually really good. It's just not consistently, I think, feels like Rush. I think this consistently feels like Rush in the way that they play together. It just has that extra element of kind of these key beds with, bass and guitar over top. So I think all of that really comes together around some pretty solid songs. I was actually surprised going into this. I was thinking it would be, I was assuming it would be weak on the songwriting standpoint for some reason, just because I hadn't, other than Show Don't Tell, there was no real, songs on this that, were played or I was that familiar with, even though I'm fairly familiar with the band. So I just assumed like the songwriting must not have been very good, but I was surprised. It was pretty solid lyrically. And I think from just a structure, craft standpoint. And again, it's just fun to hear these guys play. So I was smiling the whole time every time I listened to this. Work for you, Tim?
Well, I need to correct something. I said earlier I thought that the first Rush record I got was Counterparts, like you. I actually think it was the Chronicles compilation, because that ends with Show Don't Tell. And it came out in 90, and I probably got it, like, I didn't get it when it came out. I probably got it a couple years later, but I got it on cassette because it was a double cassette.
Yeah.
And that's probably how I knew, after knowing them in the 80s from hearing them on the radio in my parents' car, this is probably how I knew them, is like picking up this cassette and going, oh, I know that song too. I know that song, and I just got it. And then I didn't really know any of the stuff on the second side, because that was a lot of those Cynthia records that I don't think they kind of stopped playing after Moving Pictures. Like the radio stuck to the guitar oriented stuff, a lot of it. So I was always hearing like Spirit of Radio and Tom Sawyer and Limelight over and over again, but you didn't hear like New World Man like on your 97 Rock, like that kind of.
Oh yeah, I remember. I definitely remember that song. But I know what you're saying.
And I'm talking about, that's Buffalo for me.
Yeah.
Which again is very similar. Yeah, it's very similar in terms of Cleveland, in terms of having like a lot of Canadian love in terms of the bands.
But I'm with you. I got Chronicles at some point, and it may have been the first record because it was a double CD, I remember, and I think
Yep.
I probably bought it used.
Yep.
Just because I think you got all the singles. It was like the greatest hits all on one CD package.
I mean, I look at it now, and it only covers up to Presto, but I mean, it is a great representation of the first, 20 or 15 years of the band. But what works, I mean, Rush as a band works for me. So I just like hearing them play together. I've always, it doesn't matter what it is by them, whether it's the newer stuff with, from the 90s, like Counterparts and Hold Your Fire and that kind of, or not Hold Your Fire, Roll the Bones. Like that's the kind of stuff that first got me into them besides the singles, but I like all their phases. I'm still a little bit like learning about or need to spend more time with the synth records. But like I just traded in I had a crappy version of 2112 and I upgraded to like a mint 180 gram version because I wanted to properly represent that record. But there's a lot of really cool guitar riffs by Alex Lifeson on this record. Superconductor has a nice jaunty riff going on, and then I think it's the second song. Chain Lightning has a really cool chimey guitar riff part, and I mean that to me is the key, I guess, for Rush. I mean, I love Geddy if he's in whatever mode, but Alex Lifeson always has really, really cool guitar stuff, and he doesn't get mentioned with the guitar gods in the same way that Satriani or Steve Vai or that kind of stuff. But his playing is just as interesting or more so because it's in the context of these really well written radio songs. So the only thing that I just wished that they would do I don't know if they've ever done a remix, but just tighten up the 80s production a little bit on this one, because it is super 80s in a way that's I wonder if there was just a little less of the reverb or whatever is they're using, and there's a lot of chorusy effect on there. Did that bother you at all, Jay, that sound?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle a little bit with the production on this record. There's moments when I actually really think it's successful. I think the effects in guitar tones can work. There's other times where it just is a little too much. I miss the feeling, the power trio. When you get on the early records and some of the later records, you're like, okay, this is three guys playing. They're super incredibly skilled and talented, and they're able to do a lot of things that most human beings cannot do on their instruments. But I can imagine them doing this live and how they would do this live. There's moments on this record where I think there's some layering of either guitar effects, guitar sounds, keyboards that start to take away from that. And I wonder if it just would have a little more oomph. It was drier and, just simpler. I was kind of at times struggling with the addition of a lot of clean guitars or acoustic guitars on top. And sometimes those have to be, I think you were talking about how Alex Lifeson was struggling to figure out where to put guitar on the keys. And you can kind of hear that on this record. They have to make the guitar tones super brittle and small to get them to fit. Because otherwise, you think about the frequency band, the keyboards are just chewing up so much of it. And then you've got incredible bass playing on top of it. That's playing high, mid, and low. So to fit guitar on top of that, you have to make the guitars pretty small, crush them down basically so they have a place to fit so you can actually hear them. And I think what that ended up creating was distorted tones that were kind of tinny sounding. So then they like kind of layer either additional guitar, like clean guitars or acoustic guitars on top to make it sound big. A song like Scars is a good example where it it's just not punchy. It's super atmospheric. Presto has a beefy guitar in it, but you can kind of hear in that tune like how they layered on top of it, and you lose the punch. You can kind of hear that like 70s Rush guitar in there, but it's like buried behind 3 layers of acoustics, and you're like,
and a lot of reverb.
I just wish it was just that. Yeah, and a lot of reverb and chorus and a whole bunch of other stuff. So yeah, I mean, I struggle with that. I'm not saying it's like kills the record. It made me wonder, boy, what would these sound like if they were just a little drier and simpler,
Well, Neil Peart said if he had an opportunity, they would have. What did he say? I'm trying to find the actual line. He was not in love with the production.
Yeah.
Like he said it was the one record he would go back to.
Even his drums sound kind of small. Like
I did feel like I could hear all the parts he was playing, but it was a thinness to it, and I realized part of that was because he was mixing in electronic drums with his actual physical drum kit, so it's going to provide a different sound. Like I think it works like on a sound like Scars has this cool pattern that's going on that he said that he wrote in his book that he went on a bicycle tour of Africa, and he learned that rhythm from when he was playing with some people there, and then used that like an interpolation of that rhythm in that song Scars. So I like when he's doing something like that, but it's just like some of the way it's actually recorded is the way that they're affecting it is just making it sound like pitter patter.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what was going on in the 80s. It was like you used a lot of layers and you recorded everything dry, and then you added post, what it sounds like, because they're adding post like reverb and chorus and stuff to make it sound big, as opposed
was
to
it all the cocaine
in the 70s. And again, later in the 90s, it was like, well, let's just get a good room sound. And then we don't have to add so much shit. I think this was very much in the era of like, hey, let's record everything dry and electronic and then add everything on top. And that's just kind of the sound that you end up with. Sometimes it works, and other times it's like, man, this is very late 80s.
Okay, Ian, before I ask you what works and what doesn't work, if you're ranking Rush records, is this in like the top 5? Is this in like the middle 5, bottom 5, absolute worst? Like where is this falling for you in their discography?
Considering that they have 19 studio albums, I would probably rate it around middle of the pack. Some of it is obviously personal connection and that. I mean, there were a lot of songs in high school and university that I would attempt to play quite badly, but so I mean, because I did go through a lot of discography, and there are a few songs on here that I did enjoy learning the parts and playing along with. So when you're looking at that lens, it's kind of hard. And like I said, this is one of the ones that introduced me to the band. I mean, there are people that would say, okay, yeah, this is the worst 80s album, putting it underneath Signals and Grace Under Pressure and Moving Pictures, Power Windows and Hold Your Fire. I mean, Moving Pictures and Permanent Waves, I mean, that's a whole other category.
Right.
And so, it's very, when I listen to this, I mean, like, hey, it took me back to like my days in high school and university, and that when I'd be playing along, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember how this part went. I mean, I haven't played my bass in some time, and I probably should again, but unfortunately, it's in a twist of ironic fate, it's been replaced by all the paddling and athletics that I do. So Yeah, strange. I went from band geek to going and working out and on the water and exercising and all that. So a bit of a twist of fate there, but yeah, no, I mean this album. I mean, there are faults, and I'll get into that in the next section. But I mean, what works for me? I mean, this is it's a solid album, and I mean, it's very very consistent. I mean, you listen to some of the stuff with the Hold Your Fire and Power Windows beforehand, like it's very uneven at time, especially with the electronics. I mean, this album is very consistent in its presentation, and some of it may have been because it's like, okay, yes, we're going back to like those quote unquote basics. I mean, they'd say the same thing in '93 with Counterparts, and it really wasn't until 2002 with Vapor Trails where there were no electronic instruments at all. So, but they approached this album. I mean, it was kind of like, okay, let's just concentrate on what works, and then they did build up. I mean, you can hear the progression still musically from Hold Your Fire, but I mean, this is a band. I mean, they're 13 albums in, and they're all very proficient and prolific musicians. I mean, the musicianship is it keeps getting better, and they keep improving. I mean, okay, it is not their classic sound or classic songs, and that's a whole other debate. But I mean, this is them still staying at the top of their game. Whether how the public perceives that game is a different question, as you commented earlier on how it's ranked on All Music and Rate Your Music, etc.
I was just looking at 1989 November when this was released, and this is the most 1989 of all 1989s. I mean, besides Rush, you have Kenny G putting out a record, Skinny Puppy, Technotronics Pump Out the Jam comes out this month. You get a Primus album, and you get a UB40 album. You get Frank Zappa's You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore, and you get Whitesnake's Slip of the Tongue. I mean, it's just like, this is so Queen Latifah and Eric Clapton, Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock, Lisa Stansfield, Phil Collins, Quincy Jones.
Yeah. Well, in the month before, you also had Nine Inch Nails with Pretty Hate Machine, which may be kind of the reverse of your Marvelous 3 rule, where it's like, what's a late 80s album, which is associated as a 90s album?
And you had, this is some drama right here. You had Ace Frehley's Trouble Walkin' released on October 13th, followed 1 week later by Kiss's Hot in the Shade.
Yeah.
What are the odds that they be released 1 week apart?
And they both have the same single on them. Hide Your Heart.
It's like the mid '90s with Blur versus Oasis when they both dropped the single on the same day.
Well, except is the single the same song? Because in the case of Ace Frehley and Kiss, it was literally the same song, Hide Your Heart.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with Kiss, but
this is next level.
Yeah.
So the point was that I was looking at it, and like, in the context of 1989, this record makes total sense. Like, this fits in perfectly with stuff that was going on then, and it's just that this had reached the peak of 80s production here, I think, in terms of that, just so clean and so, like, it's not dry and it's not, it's just sort of there. It's just, it feels like a cloud is the music, not like a cloud of data, but like it has like this unformed feeling.
And it may be hard to imagine now. I mean, even living through it, but they were at this point, they were already a legacy band. Like, they were considered the old guys. I mean, as were any of the bands that were still making music from the 70s. Which is incredible to think. Like, just last week they played, I mean, Geddy and Alex Lifeson just played and sounded great. So, but at this point they were already like that first wave of like, oh, these are the old bands. And there was this, I think we were seeing like the first like narrative in the press around like, well, when are they going to return to their roots and sound like, the band that had all the hit albums, forgetting that music had changed, like our album like bands were already at this point kind of dying, and we were already sort of into this like singles territory, and like they were never going to be that band again. They couldn't, and the business wouldn't let them be that. So there's already like this pressure of like, well, and then it started to become very much focused on like, well, they're using keyboards, and they, we don't want them using keyboards. They should be more like, hard rock and metal bands. And like, so I think a lot of this record, and maybe even Roll the Bones, kind of got caught up in that cycle of media coverage that then, fed into it just getting overlooked. And
even back then, I mean, there was all the stuff about Rock is Dead. I mean, like, this is 89. I mean, this is Madonna when she has the world by the balls with Blonde Ambition, and Michael Jackson still riding high off of Bad a couple of years earlier. And plus you've got like boy bands coming back and on Vogue this time with New Kids on the Block. I mean, like, rock at this time, I mean, it wasn't until a couple of years later where like, okay, you bring SoundScan and it's like, okay, this is what people are actually listening to. And then of course a little band called Nirvana releases some album called Nevermind and then just completely turns music upside down. So I mean, this is definitely a product of its time, but I mean, like, this is what the time was.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Anything else that does or doesn't work for you, Jay, on the record?
I struggled a little bit with Scars. I'm still not sure where I come on that song. It's a bit of a departure for them. It feels you can hear a bit of the world music influence. It also is probably the most danceable song they've ever created. The chorus of that, it almost feels like Duran Duran in the late 80s.
Well,
so
the
it's definitely
the
like,
legacy for. Oh, sorry.
Well, it's just definitely more like rhythmic oriented and like atmospheric, I guess, from a sound standpoint, as opposed to what the rest of the record is, which is
the keyboard sound doesn't hold up. Like, it's a bad. It's just it's a keyboard sound that is instantly dated.
But I kind of found it a little bit catchy. That line.
I like it.
This feeling, scars of pleasure, scars of pain, atmospheric changes. Like every time they would return to that hook, I would be like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, it's kind of cool. So I was a little not quite feeling that. And then like Anagram and Hand Over Fist were just other songs I just felt like were a little meandering, not quite as strong as the others. But I think Scars felt like the biggest departure, and I'm on the fence on whether it was successful or not.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that song because of this album that has the greatest legacy, because the drum part that you've mentioned was incorporated from his solos, the drum solos in concert until 2007 when he completely reworked it. I mean, you listen to the R30 in 2004. I mean, it's right there at the beginning. I mean, it was a very prominent part of Neil's drum solos. So, I mean, that is probably the greatest legacy from this album.
That's funny.
The beginning of Anagram, if you didn't know what you were listening to, it sounds like it could be a Bob Seger song. It's got this like very 80s Seger feel to it with the piano, expecting like Bob to come in like, whoa, let me tell you about it. Like,
yep.
Running against the wind.
But it pulls down and changes pretty quick. But
yes. Yeah, but it's just that intro part.
Yeah, I'm with you.
All right,
and that's a good example of like I think where this production can take over parts of the record, where you're just like, it's Rush playing, but the way that it's produced, you're like, oh my god, we're on a Bob Seger record here. Right. It's like suddenly switches, and you're like, okay, we're back to Rush.
Yeah. The production is probably my biggest thing for what doesn't work for me. I mean, the two Rupert Hine albums. I mean, this album and the following one, Roll the Bones, is probably the weakest for production for me. I mean, aside from the fact that I prefer Getty with the Rickenbacker in the 70s, and then the Fender they started using the 90s and onwards. So, but I mean, his production, like you've commented, it's very tinny, it's very light, and then you listen to what happens when they bring Peter Collins back with 93 with Counterparts and how it just beefs up the sound. I mean, mind you, yes, Getty went back to using the Fender Jazz, which has a completely different sound than the wall basses he's using on this album. Neil reconfigured his drum kits for the following album with Roll the Bones, went from the double kicks or the double bass to double kick on a single bass. And so, I mean, the band at this point, I mean, they continued to change themselves musically, and it wasn't really until 93 where you see, okay, yeah, this is them going back. And like I said, this is a production of the time. I mean, if grunge happened a couple of years earlier, or well, it was happening at this time, if it got bigger mainstream awareness at the time, I mean, like this album, I mean, you can see how it fits in with this era of Rush with their 90s albums. Like it fits in, like you can tell, like, okay, the first four albums are an era. The second four albums, from Farewell to Kings to Moving Pictures, is an era. Signals to Hold a Fire, that's the third one. Then Presto to Test for Echo in 96. And so, I mean, though there is a bit of divide with how the sound is between the first two and the second two, but I mean, you listen to it musically and you take away some of the production. It's like, no, these four albums do fit. This is an era for the band, but the production is definitely the weakest part for me on the album.
Well, let's get to our ratings for this record. Jay, is this a worthy album, a better EP, or a decent single for you?
It's a worthy album for me. I'm looking forward to kind of adding this to my regular, Rush rotation when I'm in a Rush mood. They have a pretty big catalog, so I prefer to listen to records as opposed to like greatest hits at this point. So this is a record I wouldn't think to go back to, but I will add it to my list, and I'm looking forward to spending more time with it. I think it's a worthy album, and for most general music fans that kind of like Rush but aren't experts, you could have the same experience where I did, which was more of like a feeling of discovering a whole record you didn't even know existed.
So I'm also going to go with a worthy album. I believe I was looking for it earlier. I think that there is actually a remastered release, but I don't know if it's a remix.
No, it's a remastered. So starting in 97, Mercury and Anthem, the Canadian label that Rush is on the board of associates for, they started remastering. So in 97, they released yet another compilations with the retrospective albums, and they started to remaster the albums, but it's not a remix. The only remix album they've done is Vapor Trails from 2002, but that's because there was a lot of errors in the mastering done, and kind of helped contribute to that whole loudness war. So they went back and to the source tapes and fixed up a lot of those errors.
Gotcha.
But it wasn't a remix per se. It was just they were correcting errors.
There was a. Oh, go ahead, Jay.
The version on Apple Music is also mastered for Apple Music.
Got it.
So
there's a 2015 reissue of the vinyl. I've never seen this before. It's 200 gram. I've seen 180 gram. I always thought that was it's like the Scoville for hotness just went up, and I don't know what to do about that. How much thicker can we get records? They're going to be pretty dang thick. If we go any thicker, like, that's a thick record, man. That's a thick boy.
Probably weighs as much as an acetate.
Yeah, no kidding. In like 5 years, it's gonna be like, I got this 350 gram barrel. It's the Radiohead OK Computer 40th anniversary. Like, that's nice, kid. I wish that this did get a little bit of a remixing, but I think it's a worthy record. I don't think there's anything I would necessarily kick off. There's maybe a few songs that stretch a little bit longer than they could. This man made some really great 70s records that were 42, 43 minutes long. I bet you could trim this down you could keep all the songs, but make this a 44-minute record just by trimming some fat here and there, or some jamming. Because it's probably, I mean, how many songs are there on
11
sides? No, I was thinking of side 1 of 2112.
There's just one song on
how many movements?
112, and then 7.
Okay.
And then there's 5 songs on the B side, and I'm glad in 2007 they brought back A Passage to Bangkok, and Getty had the Rickenbacker that was in the encore, so it was nice seeing that bass again. But
and that was,
I digress.
That was live on Chronicles. I always knew that as the live version because that was how I heard it for so many years.
Well, that's because when they released on CD, Exit Stage Left, that track was cut off because it was limited to 74 minutes. And then when they did the remasters in '97, that song was back on. Same thing with What You're Doing from All the World to Stage in '76. So,
gotcha. I'm gonna throw it to you. Worthy album, better EP, decent single.
This is definitely a very heavily biased worthy album for me. Obviously, I mean, you ask me what my top 5 Rush albums are. I mean, and probably most other fans, I mean, they're going to go from in any particular order from the 5 albums from 2112 to Moving Pictures. But I mean, this is like I said, this is middle of the pack, and it brings back a lot of memories. And I mean, it was definitely an enjoyable listen. I mean, every once in a while, I mean, I do go through all these albums, but this was one that I hadn't listened to in quite a bit. I mean, I could see why people are like, okay, this is down there. Like I said, it's not going to match the album. Like I said, the previous 5 albums I listed, and then everyone has their different opinions. I mean, obviously, Fly By Night has a lot of fans, and same thing. I mean, the 80s stuff, I mean, particular Signals or Grace Under Pressure more so than the other 2. But like I said, it's definitely a worthy album. It would be nice if it was a little bit more appreciated. I mean, since I mean, the band really has only really performed 2 songs in the 2000s from this album, the Past and Presto. The Past in 2002 on the Vapor Trails tour, and then the Clockwork Angels tour, it was one of the alternate songs, and then Presto and the Time Machine tour in 2010. So, but and even with compilations, I mean, this hasn't been, those 2 songs again were the only ones on the Retrospective 3 compilation 2009. So it's definitely I wouldn't say it's swept under the carpet, but it's definitely not as appreciated overall, so or represented in that.
Sure.
I mean,
and with a band
it's easy for the other albums, but I mean, Mercury pumped out like so many compilations in that. I mean, Chronicles, Retrospective, The Spirit of the Radio in 2003, Gold in 2006.
Right.
So, it's easy to see this one get forgotten about.
Well, a band with 20, almost 20, with 19 studio albums.
19.
Yeah, with 19 studio albums. You know, there's going to be lesser albums. Nobody's going to say like every album is exactly the same in terms of quality. You're going to have favorites, and you're going to have ones that you don't listen to that often. I mean, there are bands that I love that I'm like, I don't really listen to their first record because it's not that good, or I don't, I haven't liked the new stuff as much as the old stuff. I mean, that just happens. But I think it's cool with a band like Rush because you just get like you mentioned, there's like these specific eras where they try and change up the sound and go for different approaches, and that's what makes them such an interesting listen. Is they're always changing up what they're doing and challenging themselves, which is a really nerdy way to approach music. But I know some people just want to listen to music for a pop song, but you can also appreciate it on a deeper level for appreciating like what the musicians are trying to accomplish on that level.
Well, my best friend told me, I mean, he wasn't much of a fan until I took him to one of the concerts 2007. He became a fan afterwards, especially after Neil's drum solo, because he's watching the videos and his wife's telling me and he's doing the air drumming and everything. But I mean, he told me, he's like, he's like, because he's like me, I mean, big with industrial music, and it's just like, this is a musician's band. I knew I played, so it's like, yeah, I can see that, and you can see it because I mean, like in the 2000s, and that was kind of when they hit that reverence in mainstream, where it's like you've got all these bands just name dropping them as major influences, and that, I mean, ignoring the fact that Neil caused every other drummer to hear, "You're my second favorite drummer." So, but,
well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us and providing all of your perspective on this. I always like it when our guests have like a personal connection to what we're talking about.
Yeah, we can't review Rush without a Canadian. Come on.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. That would have been silly.
I know. Or a retired Cleveland DJ.
Or yeah, that would have been if we couldn't find a Canadian.
Yeah,
we got Big Chuck and Little John out here.
Are there? How many Canadians are there?
I mean,
100, 150?
36 million, I think, total.
Oh, okay.
36.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think our odds of finding a Canadian were higher than finding a retired Cleveland DJ.
That's still alive.
Right.
Right. Well, the folks at Patreon are the ones that are hearing this, so thank you for being a patron. If you haven't already, please consider leaving us some positive feedback over at Apple Podcasts. This is our 4th 80s episode of 2022. Our next one is one that's selected by Gavin. He sort of teased recently what that was going to be. You may have figured it out. You may have not figured it out, but it's going to be Halloween related. And then we'll have our final 80s episode in December, which will go up for vote in November. So, and then might be keeping it the same, might be changing it up for next year. We'll see. Still talking about it. Still discussing what's going into the stew of 2023.
We're negotiating.
What ingredients.
Wow, it's been so long. I mean, you're gonna have to start adding "Dig Me Out" 2000s.
We've been talking about it.
That's what we've been talking about.
Give us some feedback there.
You'll have to add for the polls my pirated download for that one, because it's definitely very well, even though it was around in the 90s. Thank you, IRC and all that, but it was definitely far more prevalent in the 2000s.
We should call those "Dig Me Out" LimeWire. Because that's how I accumulated a lot of music in the 2000s. Well, early 2000s.
Yeah. I don't know. I still remember 99, 2000, 2001 doing Napster. So.
Yeah, first it was Napster, and then I got into the torrenting with LimeWire, and I then started playing online poker. That somehow got me into the poker world.
Yeah, no.
All right. For Jay, I'm Tim. We're out. We'll be back in 2 months with another 80s episode of Dig Me Out. All right. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, no problem.
This was fun. Glad we got to talk about some Rush.
Yeah.
I'm
gonna go in
time.
Yeah.
We need to do Rush in the 90s.
You keep throwing out these ideas.
Every time we review a 80s record, I'm like, ooh, I want to do this band in the 90s.
Rush in the 90s is a bit mixed, just because of everything that happened to the band in the late 90s with Neil, with both of his daughter and wife, his only daughter and wife passing. So it's a great topic, but it's definitely a loaded topic. especially for the latter third. So,
and Jay and I are not emotionally developed enough to have a grown-up conversation about such things. So we're gonna have to pass on Rush in the '90s. But maybe we can do Snakes and Arrows for our 2000s episode. All right. I'm going to close up shop here, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, same here.
Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, no problem.
Have a good week.
Talk to you soon.
Yeah, I'll be looking for it. My project's almost done. I can return to listening to music more often.
Well, good.
Yeah. I'm an engineer, but I'm on site commissioning. They're building a new compressor plant. So tie into the client is this week, and then hand over shortly after. So I've been in the field. Like, I posted a couple of pictures on the Discord a couple of months ago, or a month ago. So all that heavy machinery. So it's
nice.
It's been interesting, but I'm just in the field all day. So it's like I can't listen to music and or anything. So it's like get caught up on the podcast with the 15-minute drive to work. So,
gotcha.
I hear you.
Dig Me Out has the priority. So
wow, I feel honored.
That and one other I Die You Die, which is a goth industrial music podcast. You two have the pole position. So you guys are on Tuesday, they're on Thursday. So I'm like, okay, I've got enough time to listen to you guys Tuesday, Wednesday on my drives to work, and then some for Thursday, Friday.
Well, we'll try to keep these episodes tight for you, so you can.
I know.
Oh no,
Ian's only got 15 minutes. Let's get in and out of this.
Yeah, no, I'm right on the north end of my city, but they did an extension to the road that I'm on, and it's pretty much almost making a ring road around now. And so I just take that on pretty much all the way. It's just like a highway drive now to where I have to go for my site.
Nice. Well, hopefully you get that wrapped up and can get back to enjoying music again.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
All right,
fellas.
Take care.
Have a good one.